Left-wing protesters will take to the streets, calling Donald Trump not necessarily a dictator right now, but instead likening Donald Trump to a king. It's a surprising approach for Americans to take, because if they actually knew the history, both of America and also before America, they would know that this question of the relationship between the powers is actually a very, very complicated one. And I'm going to start, actually, by going back long before the American Revolution. I want to look at another revolution in the English-speaking world that took place a century earlier. As 2025 draws to a close, Americans are thinking more and more about the semi-quincentennial of the nation, which is coming up in 2026. This will be 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and really the high point of the American Revolution, and the point at which we decided that we no longer wanted to be simply a set of British colonies, but rather that we were a nation of our own, and we were entitled to our own style of government. Now, as Americans think back to the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, a question that often arises is whether America was founded as a liberal country. And if the answer is yes, then that obviously puts conservatives in the 21st century in a very awkward position, because then the question is, what exactly is it that we are conserving? If we are trying to conserve a form of liberalism, that seems a little bit ironic. It means that perhaps American conservatives would have to be opposed to conservatives in other places where they're opposing different kinds of traditions. It might also mean that perhaps conservatism simply doesn't have any real foothold at all in the United States, and that in fact, trying to conserve an older form of liberalism might turn out to be futile, and it may be the case that liberalism ultimately evolves from what it was in the late 18th century to what it has become in a rather degenerate form in the 21st century. Now, alternatively, it could be the case that this mythology, which is often promulgated in our high school textbooks and in undergraduate education, and for that matter, even in the higher reaches of higher ed, in graduate classes and among professors, and indeed among journalists who take their cues from the academy, it may be that this mythology, which says that the American Revolution was fundamentally a revolution in support of a kind of liberalism, is false. And that maybe, in fact, there is a conservative dimension to the American Revolution. Perhaps the revolution itself was conservative. Perhaps it was a mixed phenomenon in which there were both conservative and liberal elements. Or then again, maybe these terms, conservative and liberal, which only become widely used in politics in the English-speaking world in the 19th century, so decades after the American Revolution, maybe these terms don't apply to the American Revolution at all. Now, these are a series of very big questions, and they also reflect on one of the debates that's going on the American right at the moment over the question of what kind of conservatism we're supposed to have, whether in fact the conservatives of the 21st century, in some cases Trump supporters, in some cases young people on the right, Generation Z, for example, who are very critical of a number of positions that an earlier generation of conservatives, the baby boomers, had taken on things like free trade or on immigration or on foreign policy. Is it the case that American conservatism itself is betraying its older traditions by now taking a skeptical view of free trade, by taking a very skeptical, in fact, critical view of mass migration, and by also saying that we should not get involved in so many foreign conflicts around the world? Is this, in fact, American conservatives turning their back on their own tradition? That's one of the great battles that's being fought among conservative commentators right now in the 2020s. And this is often something that is then thrown back into one's view of the founding era and the question of the very, essentials of being an American and of what the American Revolution was all about. And some people I think might fairly be called perhaps second or third generation neoconservatives, have the view that because America had a strong ideologically liberal foundation, that therefore our mission has always been to promote liberalism and democracy all around the planet, either through economic integration, ultimately leading to free trade among nations, or and/or I should say, through military force, through the fighting campaigns against dictators all around the planet, and also, of course, spreading just American ideas and ultimately Americanizing the entire world, spreading our ideas because they are good ideas. They're ideas that have made us great. Therefore, why shouldn't they make the entire world great? Why shouldn't they be exported to the entire globe? So all of these questions, some of which involve the nature of conservatism today, some of which are about the historical foundations of the United States, and then the question of where the world is going as a whole and what role America and conservatives are going to play in the formation of the 21st century planet Earth. All of these things are questions that intersect and influence one another. There's enough to discuss here that I'm actually going to take, perhaps sporadically over the next several podcasts, different segments of these questions and address them piece by piece. And I'm going to start, actually, by going back long before the American Revolution. I want to look at another revolution in the English-speaking world that took place a century earlier. And this is going to be the lead up to what's called the Glorious Revolution, which takes place at the end of 1688 and beginning of 1689. In Great Britain. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, and if you are enjoying this podcast, please hit the like button and please share this podcast with all your friends. And hey, it's the holiday season, with your family too, and with anyone you think might benefit from learning about conservatism's deeper ideas and the history that informs how our country should be governed, that informs things like the creation of our own Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. These will be major themes of the Modern Age podcast as we go forward into 2026. If you enjoy the Modern Age podcast, please check us out on social media as well. We are on Twitter. We are on other media. You can find this podcast, wherever good podcasts are available, on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere. And of course, we also have the Modern Age website, where you will find wonderful daily content each workday, talking about some of the, both permanent questions of politics and philosophy, and also some of the events of the day and how they connect to the deeper history of our traditions. You can find the Modern Age website at modernagejournal.com. Again, that's modernagejournal.com. And finally, you can subscribe to the wonderful print edition of Modern Age through the website as well. The print edition of Modern Age comes out every 3 months. It's a quarterly, and it is a place where you will find the finest conservative thought anywhere. Now, Britain in the 17th century had a civil war. And at the end of the Civil War, there is a sense of regret over the fact that there had been this civil war which had overthrown and, in fact, killed a king, and which had created a republic, but a republic that proved to be very short-lived. It lasted about a decade or so, and it generally didn't make people happy. The Republic itself, the Commonwealth as it was called, wound up very quickly dissolving into a dictatorship by Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was the leader of the new model army that had been built and which defeated the King's armies in the Civil War. Oliver Cromwell was what we basically would call in the 21st century a dictator. When he found that Parliament was not cooperating with him, even though he had fought and had formed an army to defend Parliament, Cromwell said, well, look, if the Parliament is not going to go along with me as the military commander, if Parliament cannot even agree among its own members in how to run the country, then I'm just going to have to dismiss Parliament. We're just not going to do this anymore. Instead, I, as the Lord Protector of the Kingdom of England, will be running the show. And then Cromwell and his major generals, they're the ones who are basically in charge of the English Commonwealth. So you have a very quick series of regime changes or constitutional evolutions or degenerations, depending on your point of view, where what starts out as a monarchy then gives way to something that is a quasi-democracy, a commonwealth, and then quickly becomes a dictatorship. The British go through this cycle, and they decide that they do not want to perpetuate it. They decide that they're going to restore the monarchy at the end of this process. They're going to bring back a king, and they're going to have a mixed system from there on, where the king and the parliament are supposed to share power. And real sovereignty in the United Kingdom is going to be basically the combination of the king in parliament. So when you put the king and parliament together, that's when you get what is a fully sovereign body in England. By the way, I should say I'm being a little incautious in the way I use the terms Britain, United Kingdom, and England, because these are Great Britain is the island, which includes both England and Scotland, which are independent kingdoms at this time. You also have, they are independent kingdoms, but they are united with a single king. So the Scottish line of monarchs, the Stuarts, wind up becoming the English line of monarchs as well. The English, at the end of the Tudor dynasty, they invite the Stuart dynasty to come down from Scotland and occupy the throne of England. Now, keep in mind, one reason that the English are willing to do this is precisely because they think that, in fact, Parliament is still going to have a lot of power, even if you have a foreign king, a Scottish king, sitting upon the English throne. And despite the fact that there are very strong cultural and linguistic connections between the Scottish and the English, even at that point, there are tensions as well. And there are people in England, especially among the upper classes, the aristocracy, who never quite fully accept the idea of the Scotsmen on the English throne, or even if they do accept the Stuarts on the throne of England, they don't really like the idea that the Stuarts might be drawing upon Scottish elites to staff the government of the Kingdom of England, or that they might, in general, be favorable towards Scottish interests rather than English interests. So there are interesting complications, even about the nature of the English monarchy, as we get into the 17th century. But as I say, after the terrible experience of a commonwealth which turns into a dictatorship, what's called a protectorship, but is really in effect a dictatorship, the English decide we need to have a restoration. We're going to bring back the Stuarts, we're going to bring back the monarchy, we're going to restore the House of Lords, and we're going to create a balanced constitution, a mixed constitution instead. However, Charles II, who is the Stuart monarch who gets brought back to occupy the throne again. Now, his father has been executed. Now he is taking the throne after the Commonwealth. Charles II has spent his exile during the Commonwealth period in France. France has an actual absolute monarchy, and in fact, a Catholic absolute monarchy. So now, in addition to the question of are the Stuarts a little too Scottish for the English tastes, there also is this increasing concern, are the Stuarts, who already, before the Civil War, had frightened some of members of Parliament because it seemed as if the Stuart monarchs were perhaps being a little too haughty, a little too absolute in their tendencies. Now there's a question, are the Stuarts taking the wrong lessons from France, from being in a Catholic country with an absolute monarch? Are they now going to start importing this, Catholic religion and the idea of absolute monarchy into England now? So there's a little bit of tension, even after the Restoration, where there's concern that perhaps, Charles II has been a little bit corrupted by his experience in France during the years of the Commonwealth. And there's another problem too. While Charles has a number of illegitimate children, he doesn't have a legitimate heir to the throne. And that means that when Charles dies, and he is getting older and older, that his brother, James, the Duke of York, is going to take the English throne. Now, James is actually Catholic. And this is a big concern for the Protestant aristocracy and, much of the Protestant middle class as well in England. They're very concerned about this. Nevertheless, nobody wants to go back to a civil war. Nobody wants to go back to, a commonwealth or a dictatorship, a protectorate. Instead, they want to have a continuation of the monarchy. So, sure enough, as it looks as if Charles II is going to be succeeded by James, the Duke of York, who will ultimately become James II, there arises a question in Parliament about whether maybe Parliament could exert its power in order to make sure that you do not have an indefinite line of Catholic monarchs taking the throne. And the plan is this. They basically want, if they can, members of Parliament to exclude. First of all, they want to exclude James, the Duke of York, from the line of succession. They want to say, yes, we're going to have a king, but in fact, you can't have a Catholic king. So if there's going to be a succession after Charles, it has to go to the next closest Protestant member of the Stuart bloodline. It cannot go to James. And you'll see a lot of developments at the end of the 17th century where you have Parliament and the members of Parliament who are most take a most limited view of the powers of the monarchy and who are in many cases very strongly anti-Catholic as well. These members of Parliament want to basically rig the line of succession, of royal succession, so that you will not have Catholics occupying the throne, and that instead Protestant members of the royal family will be the ones who are advanced. That you'll basically skip over the next closest heir, and instead you'll go to a Protestant who is a little bit further down the bloodline. This becomes a significant debate in Parliament in the 1670s. It becomes known as the Exclusion Crisis. And the whole point here, again, is that members of Parliament who want to prevent a Catholic from coming to the throne are trying to enact legislation that will say Parliament is decreeing that the line of royal succession goes from Charles II to the next closest Protestant after him once Charles dies, if he dies without a direct heir. So you have a faction in Parliament that is pushing this view, that wants to exclude a Catholic from the throne. And they're willing to, keep in mind, this is not just about religion, it's also about the relative powers of the monarch and the Parliament, or you might say the executive branch and the legislative branch. These members of Parliament want to control the royal line of succession, which is pretty close to saying that they actually control, we would say now, the election of the president, right? It means that the legislature is exerting power over the executive, is exerting power over the monarch, and is saying, well, okay, we're going to be able to basically choose our own monarch. Because, of course, if Parliament has the power to legislate that you're not going to have a Catholic take the throne in England, why couldn't Parliament also legislate that, perhaps there are other disqualifications? Perhaps, Parliament is going to not only disqualify people from the throne, but is instead going to actively specify who can take the throne and is going to decide basically who is going to be king. So there's a big question of the nature of government here, whether you have a mixed government where the king and the Parliament independently have powers and have to basically work out between themselves how those powers are going to balance and thereby, keep England free and prosperous, or whether you're going to have a system where one branch of government, Parliament, is going to be supreme over another, the king, the monarchy, and the Parliament is going to be all-powerful. Now, a faction in Parliament says this would actually be a terrible thing, because even though they are members of Parliament themselves, they say that basically this is just going back to the same conditions that led to the Commonwealth and led to the collapse of the Commonwealth ultimately, and led to a dictatorship by the military, by a military leader in the late days of the English Commonwealth. They say basically Parliament had proven at the end of the Civil War that it was not capable of ruling the country by itself. It could not even agree upon, how to govern within its own members, among its own members. And so Parliament is not capable of doing that. You have to have a balanced constitution, a mix of king and Parliament. And that means that Parliament can't have the power to decide who's going to sit upon the throne, that instead the line of succession of the monarchy has to be preserved, even if that means that a Catholic is going to come to the throne. And it should be pointed out that the members of Parliament who take this point of view, they're not necessarily pro-Catholic. In fact, many of them are very strongly anti-Catholic. They're very devoted to the Church of England, but they say the principle of the separation of powers, the principle of the monarchy and Parliament being independent, branches of government, this must be sustained, and it would not be sustained if you had Parliament dictating the line of succession. Now, I should also add a further complication, because while I've just described a basically royalist faction, which says that their view is that you have to maintain the mixed constitution by maintaining the proper line of succession in the monarchy, and you can't have Parliament dictate the line of succession and take up power, assume power over the monarchy. While their position is that they are standing up for a mixed constitution, the other side, the side which supports the exclusion bill, which says that Parliament does have the power to determine the line of succession, that side claims that the other side, the defenders of royal succession, hereditary succession, they claim that this other side are not just royalist, but they are in fact absolutist. They claim that in fact, really, the supporters of the royal line of succession, the supporters of the House of Stuart, are themselves trying to go back to a more French-style absolutist government, and that maybe they're even crypto-sympathetic to Catholics as well. So there is a complicated situation here at the end of the 17th century in England. And you have these two factions, which ultimately wind up having names that are going to be somewhat familiar, certainly to students of the American Revolution. They're somewhat familiar names even today. The supporters of the Exclusion Bill wind up taking the name, or being given the name, which they then accept, of Whigs. So they basically become what is known as the Whig Party. which is going to be very important all the way up until the 19th century in England. It's important for America, too. America's revolutionaries generally thought of themselves as Whigs, even if they had other factional differences among themselves. So on the one side, you have the Whigs who say that, yes, Parliament has the ability to legislate the line of succession for the king. On the other side, those who say that you must not have this kind of parliamentary supremacy over the monarchy. These individuals who see themselves as supporters either of the monarchy itself or of a mixed government of monarchy and parliament, this side comes to be known as the Tories. And as many of you will know, the word Tory in the UK today is often used as a synonym for conservative. So members of the Conservative Party in Great Britain in the 21st century even are known as Tories. That's kind of the nickname of the parties in the same way that, GOP, the Grand Old Party, is the nickname of the Republican Party. The Conservatives in the UK are also known as Tories. So basically, one of the origins of the division between conservatives and what comes to be later called liberals, one of the distinctions between left and right in the English-speaking world is precisely here. It's in the creation of these two parties, the Tories and the Whigs, on this question of the line of succession, the religious composition of the monarchy itself, and then by extension the country as a whole. So there's a religious policy involved. There is also, of course, the question of the relationship between the branches of government. And you can see why our founding fathers took very seriously these questions about the relationship between the different branches of government that are going to ultimately be set up by the United States Constitution. So we have independent branches. We have Congress and the executive and the president, that is, and the courts, the Supreme Court in particular, which are separate and distinct branches of government in the United States. Well, there was an antecedent British tradition where these questions were already being asked about what the relationship is supposed to be. The British answer, by the way, and even the Whigs, who are supporters of the Exclusion Bill and who want to be able to say that Parliament will determine the line of succession of the monarchy, even the Whigs basically resist and try to reject the idea that they are, in fact, simply claiming parliamentary supremacy. The Whigs will still say that they believe in a mixed government of king and parliament. They simply say that one of Parliament's proper powers is this ability to determine the succession. So, seen from one light, the Whigs and the Tories agree on principles. They agree that England is meant to be a mixed constitution, but they disagree on exactly what that means, with the Tories saying the mixture means pretty much equality between king and parliament, and with the Whigs saying that you're never actually going to have this equality among the branches, and that instead you're either going to have a parliament which is going to be slightly more powerful perhaps than the king, or otherwise a king who's ultimately going to become a French-style absolutist monarch. Now, it may be difficult to relate these questions that the Whigs and the Tories are dealing with at the end of the 17th century in England to later concerns as we have today in America about what the difference is between left and right, what the difference is between conservatives and liberals or between conservatives and progressives. I'll get into this in later podcasts, but I'll simply say that you can see already certain themes which may be influencing even our discourse now in the 21st century. So you see right now, for example, a number of left-wing protesters will take to the streets, protesting against Donald Trump, calling Donald Trump not necessarily a dictator right now, but instead likening Donald Trump to a king. And so they will have these protests and they will say, "We want no kings." Well, that's it's a surprising approach for Americans to take, because if they actually knew the history, both of America and also before America, of English constitutionalism, they would know that this question of the relationship between the powers is actually a very, very complicated one. And that, in fact, even Americans were not anti-monarchical at the beginning of the American Revolution. Far from it. What actually happens, I'll explain this very briefly. So the Tories actually win the exclusion crisis during the 1670s in England. They win it in part, well, for two reasons, actually. The Tories they don't really have a majority within Parliament, but they have two other things going for them that actually makes them succeed despite not having a parliamentary majority. One is that the king is very much, of course, as you might expect, on their side. So the king says, no, I don't want parliament dictating what the line of royal succession is. So I am going to, give all the support I possibly can to the Tories in fighting the exclusion bill. And that includes the king at this point has the ability to simply dismiss parliament. So the parliament is aware that the king is actually holding a number of cards that he can use, a number of powers that he can use in order to frustrate this legislation that is trying to dictate the line of succession. The other thing that the Tories have going for them is the English people. Because the English people, they have a great deal of love for the monarchy. Now think about this. During the English Commonwealth, in the aftermath of the Civil War, you might think, oh, this would be great. You start out with a democracy, you start out with Parliament being in charge. But keep in mind, most Englishmen don't have the property qualifications to be able to vote for Parliament. So Parliament is not really a democratic institution in the 17th century. It's an oligarchic institution. It's an institution that most of the English people don't necessarily see as representing them. It is an institution that is basically seen as representing the moneyed interests and the aristocratic interests against both the king and the people. And the people of England, even though they don't elect the king, they consider the king to be, in a way, the personal embodiment of the kingdom itself, including the people themselves. And so the English people are actually more sympathetic to the king than they are to Parliament. And they also think back, when Parliament was briefly in charge during the Commonwealth, it was not a fun time for England. Parliament was, in fact, controlled by Puritans who, they shut down the theaters, they discouraged Christmas celebrations. They, discouraged dancing. The Parliament, the Puritans in Parliament, who, keep in mind, the Puritans are a very intense wing. They are not totally separate at this point, but they are very much an intense wing that says, of the Church of England, who say that the Church of England is not Protestant enough. And that's why they are Puritans. They want to purify the Church of England and make it thoroughly Protestant according to their own understanding of Protestantism. And so the Puritans are not only anti-Catholic, which is just taken for granted because almost everyone is anti-Catholic at this point, but the Puritans also want to disrupt the Church of England and make the Church of England much more strongly Protestant. And they see that the Church of England, even though it is quite anti-Catholic, it still resembles the Catholic Church too much for the taste of the Puritans. Now, up to a point, the English people are willing to go along with the Protestants, but beyond that point, with the Puritans rather, beyond that point, however, the people of England are very loyal to the Church of England. So they not only like the idea of the monarchy, but they also really like the idea of the Church of England. And the Puritans are simply taking things too far for the tastes of the people of England. As a result, the people of England are not very happy with parliamentary rule, which is Puritan rule, during the Commonwealth. And then, of course, the Puritans themselves can't agree on what kind of agenda they're going to pursue when they're in charge of Parliament. And so Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the military, winds up simply saying, well, fine, I'm going to rule without you. I'm just going to have a protectorship instead. So when we think about these disputes among the English constitutional disputes in the late 17th century, we are talking about an English people which not only loves the fact that the monarchy has been restored and that sees the king as an embodiment of the people, but also the English people are very skeptical of being ruled basically by oligarchs and by ultra-Protestants and by, members of parliament that they find pretty disagreeable. So the English people and the king are both on the side of the Tories, and ultimately through, both public protests and through the king's proroguing of parliament, you're able to prevent the exclusion bill from passing. And it seems like the crisis is over at this point. So the Whigs have been defeated, the Tories have been victorious. You continue to have a direct hereditary line of succession with the monarchy, and Parliament has been prevented from asserting greater powers over the king. However, what then happens is, sure enough, Charles II dies without leaving a legitimate heir. that means that the Catholic James II then takes the throne. At first, this is not seen as a major crisis, and even the more anti-Catholic or pro-Protestant elements within Parliament, they're accepting of this. They want to make sure that they are protecting Protestant interests, but they accept the idea that, yes, there's a Catholic on the throne of England again. They do start to complain more and more, however, because they think that James II, as a Catholic king, is starting to favor Catholics and is starting to persecute, or generally be hostile towards Protestant interests. So there is this big religious dispute taking place in England. The Tories don't see themselves as being a pro-Catholic party, but they are pro-monarchical, and the monarchy is more important to them in some sense. And this is putting it very crudely, but I think it's important simply to simplify for the sake of understanding. The Tories, in some sense, are more pro-monarchy than they are pro-Protestant, whereas the Whigs are more pro-Protestant than they are pro-monarchy. The other problem here, or another complicating factor, is that not only do you have these questions of monarchy versus Parliament, not only do you have Catholic versus Protestant, or Church of England, whether it should be more Protestant or more Catholic in its ecclesiology, you also have the influence of the classical literature and classical history and philosophy that is being read by both sides. So both the Whigs and the Tories are influenced by a whole range of thinkers, Cicero, by Roman history, by Greek history. And so they're thinking also in these fundamental terms of the types of regimes that are talked about by Cicero or by Aristotle or by any number of other classical authorities. So their minds are very open to these radical possibilities. And when they think about the English Constitution, they're thinking about it in terms, in part, of how it is related to the kinds of classical regimes that are discussed by Aristotle and Cicero. This is why the English consider it so important to have a kind of mixed regime of the sort that Polybius, for example, the great Greek historian who looks upon the success of Rome in conquering Greece and says, what makes the Romans successful? And Polybius's answer in part is that the Romans have a mixed regime. So the British, the English are trying to create a mixed regime as well. And the question is exactly what that mixture looks like. In 1688, 1689, however, as I'd said earlier, there is a revolution. And what happens is this. In the years leading up to that, not only do you have a Catholic on the throne, James II, but then the question becomes, what happens after James? Now, at first, the Whigs and the Protestants are kind of hopeful that if, yes, you may have this Catholic monarch for a short time, but once he's gone, then, the throne is going to ultimately fall to a Protestant again, and that's going to, basically resolve things in favor of Protestantism. But, so the question is James II himself going to produce a legitimate heir? And if he does, will that legitimate heir then be Catholic? And this is, a question hanging over the Parliament, and both members of the Tory party and the Whig party are concerned about this. Well, sure enough, James II does succeed in producing a legitimate heir who is indeed going to be a Catholic, who's going to be a son. Now, a son and heir who is a Catholic, which means that you're now going to have basically probably a permanently Catholic English monarchy, going from James II to his son and then onwards. And this, the Whigs find completely unacceptable, and a number of Tories, and remember I'd said that the Tories themselves were anti-Catholic as well. They wanted to defend the Church of England, they wanted to defend the monarchy, they did not want to become radically Protestant, but they also didn't want to become Catholic. The Tories and a number of key Tory leaders basically say, you know what, the Whigs were right. Now we're in this mess where we're going to have a series of Catholic kings. They're going to change, the balance of power in England between Protestantism and Catholicism. They're going to re-Catholicize the country, possibly by force, possibly, through persecution of Protestants. We want to prevent that. And therefore, the Tories wind up joining together with the Whigs in order to stage a revolution. And what they do is they invite, Mary, who is a Stuart princess who is married to William of Orange over in the Netherlands. They invite William and Mary to come over and take the throne jointly, so they're going to be king and queen, in place of James II. And James II is said to have resigned or abdicated the monarchy. That's not really true. I mean, James II was certainly pressured and thrown out. It was a relatively bloodless revolution, but nonetheless, it was still in quite real terms a revolution. But in retrospect, and very soon in retrospect, in the 17th century, by the end of the century, you have both Whigs and Tories kind of agreeing that we're not going to call this we're going to call it a revolution, but we're not going to call it the overthrow of a king. We're going to call it an abdication. The king is said to have abdicated. He has, left the country and thereby left the throne vacant. And so William and Mary have a clear path to become the king and queen. So that's what happens, which sets up the form of government that Britain winds up having as we get into the next century, the 18th century, and as we get towards the American Revolution. So Parliament has basically gained a lot of power over the course of these events. Parliament now, not only has tried to claim the power to dictate the line of succession, but Parliament has even, at this point, with the Revolution of 1688 or 1689, has now said that it can actually, again, they don't like to say depose a king, but basically that, Parliament is in a position to even change who's on the throne of England, when there is not a death, of a king. Parliament has the power basically to determine the lines of succession and also who's occupying the throne. So Parliament, in many respects, seems to be quite, supreme already at this point, at the late part of the 17th century. There are some complications to that, however. So William of Orange, this Dutchman who's been invited over to take the throne of England along with his English wife, Scottish English wife, I should say, Mary. William of Orange is actually much more old-fashioned in his views of monarchy. So even though he really owes the fact that he becomes king largely to the Whigs, he tries to conduct government and he tries to appoint ministers who are going to represent both Whigs and Tories. He tries to have a balanced cabinet. And even though, his personal interests have been aligned with the Whigs, his philosophy of government is much closer to that of the Tories. And he really doesn't like this idea that Parliament is going to be, he has to defer to Parliament to a certain extent. And keep in mind, he's a foreigner who's been put on the throne of England. Nevertheless, William III has a very old-fashioned view of monarchy. He doesn't want to be an absolute monarch, but he certainly does want to be a king, fully, in his own right. And so he wants to support the Tories as a balance against these Whigs who want to continue adding more and more power to the Parliament. Now, maybe in later podcasts, I will come back to what happens between 1688 and the beginnings of the American Revolution, which, of course, it begins even years before 1776. It begins in the early to mid 1770s, and there are people who can trace the American Revolution, in its infancy, even back to the French and Indian War and to some of the consequences of that conflict between the British Empire and the French in the New World in North America. But let me briefly wrap up by taking us back to the American Revolution and this question of monarchy. So, as you get into the first stages of the American Revolution, first of all, everyone at this point in America pretty much thinks of themselves as Whigs. And even in Britain, basically everyone thinks of themselves as Whigs. There are a few exceptions. There are some literary men, some political thinkers like Samuel Johnson, the great literary critic and the creator of the dictionary. Samuel Johnson is a proud, self-identified Tory, but there are extremely few of them in Britain at this point in the 1770s. And that's basically because the Tory cause came to be identified over the course of the 18th century with absolute monarchy and with rebellion against England and even with treason. This is because the Tories, I'd mentioned the Glorious Revolution and how the Tories teamed up with the Whigs in order to put William and Mary on the throne of England. But a little bit later, basically, the Tories sort of come to regret it. And this is after William is gone, and it's actually after the death of Queen Mary and then her sister, Queen Anne. And then there's once again a vacancy on the throne and the question of who is going to be the next monarch of England. This is, in the early 1700s. And there are these, and the Whigs and the Tories basically have different candidates that they would prefer to see take the throne of England. The Tories basically sympathize with the direct line of succession that was, curtailed with the Glorious Revolution. They want to restore, the Stuarts, and they want to have a, what's then called a Jacobite, because, Jacobus is the Latin name, which becomes both James and Jacob. So if you are a supporter of the James faction, you're usually called a Jacobite. The Tories have strong Jacobite sympathies. They want to restore this direct line of succession. They want to restore the heirs to James II to the throne of England. These heirs of James II have spent a lot of time in France. That's where they've been in exile. And in France, they've been guests of Louis XIV, who is, of course, an absolute monarch in the most full sense of the term. And, of course, France is also a Catholic country. So the Tories, in sympathizing with the Jacobites and wanting to restore the Jacobite line of succession, the Tories come to be seen as basically pro-French. They come to be seen as sort of traitors to the English Constitution because they want to undo, in some sense, the Revolution of 1688. And they also come to have, a kind of whiff of being pro-Catholic as well. And so this is one of the, conflicts between the two parties in the early part of the 18th century in England. And the Tories do a number of things which pour fuel on the fire. So the Tories, when after Queen Anne dies, she's the sister of Queen Mary. So William and Mary die without an heir. Queen Anne then becomes Queen. Queen Anne ultimately dies. She doesn't leave an heir. And then the throne is, open. Where's it going to go? And it can either go back to the Jacobite line of succession, which has been hosted in France, or it can go all the way to Germany, where you can find a Protestant heir to the throne in the little statelet of Hanover. And, people who know their history know, of course, it is the Hanoverian line of succession, which winds up taking the English throne. So that's how you wind up with a German on the throne of England. And that too, how much power is a German king going to wield over the country of England and an English parliament? He can't even speak the language or doesn't speak it very well. So this, again, winds up being something that strengthens the power of parliament relative to the monarchy in 18th century England. And the Tories, because they side with the Jacobites, and they even engage in a couple of rebellions where they actually invite invasions by Irish and French Jacobite forces and rebellions in the Scottish Highlands. The Tories come to be involved in all of this kind of attempt to restore the Jacobite line. One reason they do it is because even early on, when it's clear that the Tories have more sympathies to the Jacobites and the Whigs have more sympathies with the Hanoverians, once you get a Hanoverian king, George I, on the English throne, naturally this King of England, who pretty much only speaks German, he sides with the people who supported him. He sides with the people who brought him over to become king, and that's the Whigs. So he doesn't invite any Tories into his government. He does the opposite of William of Orange, William III. William III tried to have a balanced cabinet consisting of both Tory and Whig ministers, a ministry of talents of all parties. Whereas George I, when he ultimately takes the throne, pretty much only picks Whigs. And then, as the Tories say, we're never going to have power again because now you've got the king and these Hanoverians are going to be against us, forever and ever. They then try to support, rebellious actions to bring the Jacobites back, to bring the James line of succession back. And so that, of course, makes the Tories even more politically toxic because now not only are they complaining about the German on the throne of England, but also they are actively, inviting invasions and rebellions in an attempt to have a coup or a counter-coup to restore the line of James II. So the Tories are so discredited by all of this over the course of the 18th century. And of course, the Whigs, do everything they possibly can, including they change the election laws so that the Whigs basically pass what is called the Septennial Act, which says you're only going to have an election for Parliament every 7 years. And so in the course of that 7 years, the Whigs don't have to worry about the kinds of elections that we Americans have to worry about. We have elections for the House of Representatives every 2 years. And one reason we have elections for the House every 2 years is because the American revolutionaries and the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, they did not like the precedent that was set by the Septennial Act in England, by this idea that Parliament could simply give itself such an extended term of 7 years that it became virtually impossible for, opposition to organize. So, people could want to throw Parliament out during the course of that 7 years, but it would be extremely difficult to do without an election. And then by the time you get to the end of that 7 years, Parliament can use all of the power that it has acquired during those 7 years, all of the money that is allocated, all the, emoluments and other, what we would now call grifting, that Parliament, the spoils and way of rewarding cronies the Parliament has been able to enjoy during 7 years, it can take that money and use it to basically buy off the next election. So having elections only once every 7 years is, we would now say, very anti-democratic, but in fact it was something that Parliament, controlled by Whigs, and the Whigs, by the way, they think of themselves very proudly as the party of British freedom and the party of constitutionalism and, the party that represents the people in a more profound way than the monarchy does. Well, the Whigs themselves tried to basically acquire permanent power by using the spoils system and by using the Septennial Act to make sure that they can't even be voted on, that the public doesn't even get a chance to pass judgment on Parliament until 7 years have passed. So the Septennial Act is very effective, and the Tories have discredited themselves with all these rebellions. As a result, by the end of, or by the last quarter of the 18th century, the Whigs have total power. Everyone considers themselves a Whig. And really the more important question in Parliament is not Whigs versus Tories. It's different factions of the Whigs who are fighting among themselves. Some factions of Whigs are very supportive of or depend upon the favor of the king in order to have power. And others want to have, are very critical of the king. They are not in cabinet, and so they are opposition Whigs, and they are they style themselves as a country party rather than a court party. This is going to have to be a subject for a later podcast, but I wanted to make sure that I at least draw the outlines right now, because again, you can kind of see, you can trace how some of this is going to come into play in the American Revolution. So in the American Revolution, the American revolutionaries themselves all think of themselves as Whigs. But that doesn't mean they're anti-monarchical, because the Whigs themselves, again, even though they were constantly putting more power in Parliament, they were saying that, in fact, they were supportive of a mixed constitution, too. They just wanted a mixed constitution in which Parliament somewhat had the upper hand over the monarchy. They didn't want to abolish the monarchy. They didn't want to create a republic. So to the extent that Americans identified as Whigs, they too were supporters of a mixed constitution, and they too were supporters of the idea of maintaining relationship with the king. Now, what I just explained, which is that the Whigs were constantly putting more and more power in Parliament in Westminster, the Parliament of England. Not only do you have things like the Septennial Act, which make the Whigs a permanent party in power in Westminster, but also you have Parliament taking more and more of a role in determining the law in North America, in the American colonies. So Parliament, even though the whole point of Parliament, you would think, is that people, that it has legitimacy because it represents the people of England. It represents the people of England because at least some of them do get to vote for members of Parliament. Not all of them. Most of them don't, but some of them do. And so that's the basis of, Parliament's own legitimacy. And yet no American gets a vote on members of Parliament. This is, again, the classic slogan, taxation without representation. Americans do not have representation in this extremely powerful Parliament in Westminster. So they are subject to the Parliament without actually having a say on what Parliament's doing. There's certainly not a direct say. Now, this means that the American revolutionaries, at first, they're very upset at Parliament. They're upset at the laws that Parliament is passing, which are seen to be against America's interests. And they naturally look to the balancing mechanism within the British Constitution itself to defend America's interests. And what is that balancing mechanism? It's King George III. So the Americans initially, they are petitioning King George III. They want George III to take their side against Parliament. They want the king to start asserting a little bit more power to stop Parliament from passing laws that are against the interests of the American colonies. And when George III doesn't do that, when George III instead continues to side with Parliament, and he says that basically both himself and Parliament have total power together over the American colonies, this is what leads the American colonists to say, you know what, we're not only going to have to sever our connection with England, but also we're now going to start criticizing the king personally. So in the earliest phases of the revolution, the king was usually exempted from the criticisms or was criticized only very mildly. By the time you get to 1776, the king has firmly taken the side of Parliament. The Americans are now against both king and Parliament. We're going to have independence instead, and now the Americans are going to criticize the king and Parliament alike. Keep in mind, however, this even now is not necessarily a revolt against the principle of monarchy itself or against monarchs in all situations. It is specifically a revolt against George III as a bad monarch, as a monarch who is taking the side of Parliament. And it is a rejection of British imperial rule, which is basically parliamentary rule much more than it is monarchical or kingly rule. So, the American Revolution did not start out as being an anti-monarchical revolution. And in fact, this is getting a little ahead of the story, but it's important. As you get toward the Constitutional Convention and the eventual creation of the American Constitution, you may know of this famous legend, which is partly true and might be a subject for a future podcast, but this famous legend that at one point a woman comes up to Benjamin Franklin after the Constitutional Convention and says, "Sir, what have you wrought? What kind of government have you created?" And Benjamin Franklin's reply is, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Well, this was a legitimate question. It was totally possible that the Constitutional Convention could have chosen to create a monarchy or to have a mixture of monarchy and representative legislature. George Washington was so enormously popular as the general who had led America to victory that if he wanted to be an Oliver Cromwell, he wouldn't have had to use military force to do it. He simply would have been popular enough that he could have declared himself a king or a lord protector, and chances are everyone would have accepted it, or at least it would have had a very good chance of succeeding. So the fact that we are a republic owes a great deal to George Washington's personal character, that he personally chose not to be a king. He personally chose not to be a Oliver Cromwell or a lord protector or a dictator. He instead chose to be just another citizen. He breaks his sword after the American Revolution, or rather, he hands his sword over to the representatives of the the Continental Congress. He surrenders his sword, which is a sign that he is recognizing civilian leadership, the Congress as the supreme authority. This is the Continental Congress after the at the end of the American Revolution. The Constitution, however, is very much concerned, even though it doesn't create a monarchy, with creating a quasi-monarchy in the form of the presidency. And the president is not going to be a monarch. It's not going to be hereditary. It's going to have many differences with the King of England. But the presidency is going to be a very powerful, independent office. And it's going to be not something that is controlled by Congress. Congress does have the power of impeachment. But that's it. Congress rather has very few other powers by which it can tame the executive. The executive branch is independent. It is not under the control of Congress. That actually turns out to be radically different from the way in which the British Constitution continues to evolve over the course of the 19th century, the 20th century, and now the 21st century. In Britain, the monarch has very, very few formal powers, and almost all power is vested in the parliament. And in a sense, even though there's still the great myth of, an independent monarchy in Britain, it's really, in fact, a republic with a figurehead monarch in the form of now Charles. So England is not really so much of a mixed constitution as it is a parliamentary, supreme legislative constitution. In some ways, it's even a very democratic constitution in that sense. America, on the other hand, actually does represent the kind of mixed government that both Whigs and Tories a century earlier in the 17th century in England that they aspired to. So the American framers of the Constitution actually succeed in creating the kind of mixed government that the English had been aiming at, for more than a century. And it's a mixed government because you do have an independent executive and an independent legislative branch. You also, of course, have an independent Supreme Court. And you have a mix of powers among these. And the fact that President Trump is using the powers of the executive branch in a way that many on the left disagree with. This is actually a healthy thing because it actually shows that President Trump is helping to reassert the proper independence of the executive branch from both, certainly from the third branch, from the courts. The courts are not meant to be supreme in America's constitutional model, and more importantly than any of that, people on the left, and this includes a lot of normie Democrats, and in fact, it includes even a lot of normie Republicans, they believe that there is something called the government, simply the government of the United States of America, the federal government, which is a permanent institution that exists independently and separately from the actual constitutional branches of government, which are the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. So this thing called the government is basically something that they imagine to be an executive other than the president. So the president is actually elected by the people, admittedly through the Electoral College, but it's basically a popular institution. It's something the American people have a check upon who is occupying the White House. They have the power to elect or not elect whomever they want. And yet there is a widespread belief among the left, including among, like I say, normie Democrats and even normie Republicans, who believe that there is a government, an executive branch even, that is independent of the president himself. There is a permanent government which has somehow been set up by Congress, even though it's in the executive branch, and that it's not answerable to the president. That is unconstitutional. That is actually something that, very much damages what our founding fathers had set up. And that, in fact, that idea of a deep state or a permanent government that is not answerable to any elected official and that is part of the executive branch but is not answerable to the president and therefore actually in some ways is more powerful than the president because this deep state, this permanent government persists even when you change presidents. And therefore, in a sense, it is permanent and has powers that the president himself does not have. This is actually the thing that is anti-constitutional. It's not only an abomination in the sight of our own Constitution, it goes against the best traditions of the English constitutionalism before us. It is a total abomination. And it's the thing that Donald Trump has been running against. It's the thing that populist MAGA conservatives has said is a very bad thing. This permanent government is in fact the enemy. It's the enemy of constitutionalism. Whereas those who are going out there and having left-wing protests and saying, no kings, they are profoundly misunderstanding history. They're misunderstanding the American Constitution. They are misunderstanding what we have inherited from the British. It's hilarious because, of course, the left wing is basically internationalist. It doesn't even like the existence of nation states. And so you'll have progressives, even in countries that have monarchs, even in Canada. Now, keep in mind, Canada, it may have a parliamentary system, but of course, it has, not just a prime minister, but it's also part of, this wider British, Commonwealth and kingdom. So you have the King of England is still the King of Canada as well. He doesn't have very many powers, but the King of England is indeed still the monarch of Canada. And in Britain, of course, the King of England is the king. Well, even in places like Canada and the UK, you have these bizarre left-wing protests, which are basically, they are the American no kings protests, but they're taking place in countries that have kings. And they're not complaining, about King Charles. It's funny. They have to restyle themselves, using different labels, even though they're part of the same international left-wing movement. Again, like I really just, want to communicate to viewers as we head into our semi-quincentennial, as we head into the 250th anniversary of American independence, we have to take seriously our own history. We have to take seriously what our Constitution actually says, how our Constitution relates to our history. These are things that do not have anything to do with what you're hearing from the left, including, of course, the left within the academy, the left within, secondary education in our high schools and primary schools, journalists. All these people are completely, utterly wrong. And what they are promulgating is actually an internationalist vision, which is very antithetical to the view of government that the American revolutionaries had. It's even antithetical to the Declaration of Independence itself. And I don't have time in this podcast to get into a careful reading of what the Declaration of Independence actually says. But even though the Declaration of Independence talks about universal rights, for sure, those universal rights are wielded by a particular people. you have to have a particular people that already is cohesive as a people, that then is going to invoke those individual natural rights in order to have a political change and to establish a new government. The left has a different view. The left says that basically you go directly from rights to government, and that government can do whatever the hell it wants because government is in fact the enforcer of rights, and government is in fact the interpreter of rights. Government decides what your rights are. That's not how the American revolutionaries thought of it, and that's not what the Declaration of Independence envisions. The Declaration actually says, no, you have individual rights, natural rights, but those rights then come together in the form of a people who then decide to create a kind of government. So the government has to be answerable to the people, not the other way around. The UN Declaration of Rights, which is promulgated after World War II, takes a very different view. But again, that's a subject for a future podcast. For now, I hope I've just helped to clarify a little bit. Even though this is a complicated subject, I wanted to talk about the necessity of understanding where these original left-right divisions come from in the Anglo-American context, this division between Whigs and Tories, and we'll talk about how they later become conservatives and liberals in a future podcast. But right now, I wanted to lay the groundwork and talk about what had happened in these debates back in the 17th century, and then how, in a brief sense, the American Revolution itself looks back at these debates that took place in England a century earlier. And ultimately, the U.S. Constitution is going to resolve those debates that the American colonists were carrying on from this English tradition. It's going to resolve them by creating a U.S. Constitution, which is a much more interesting document for the 21st century, especially in what it says about executive power, than this mythology that we've all been taught by progressives, by liberals, by the heirs of the Whigs about the power, not even of today. It's not Congress that the heirs to the Whigs want to celebrate. It's instead this very weird thing, which is neither king nor parliament, which is neither president nor Congress, but instead this permanent government, this permanent deep state, the administrative state. That is the thing that progressives put all of their faith in. It's the thing they want to see have supreme power, and yet it's something which is utterly antithetical and alien to the tradition of Anglo-American government.